It's not every day that you back two neurosurgeons that are building in compute. It's been really fun to get to know Alex and Jon and hear their conversation. What did you think?
Alex and Jon have been neuroscientists, neurosurgeons for 2 decades, but in that time, they've always been passionate about this question of using not just the design of the brain or the structure of the brain, but the brain itself to further computing. And for them, it's just obvious.
Since we met them, let's see, the biological computing company, they've raised over $50 million. They've got a full lab, awesome setup in Mission Bay. And it's really fun to go in person and just see the intersection of science and computing and what that means for the world post-silicon. We're really lucky because when this podcast is being released, they are going to be releasing an awesome demo. I think so much of the questions around TBC has been, what's this going to look like for commercial uses? And this week, we're going to be seeing a front row seat of that.
So what you're going to be able to see is a side-by-side view of two video generation models, one that has been optimized by the biological computing company and one that is not. And you should check it out and see the difference.
Amazing. We enjoyed the conversation.
The Compute 100 is a podcast about the most consequential market in AI.
These are the conversations with builders and investors about the technology and the capital powering the greatest infrastructure build-out ever.
I'm Brian Schechter.
I'm Gabby Lorenzi.
We're investors at Primary.
Let's dive in to the Compute 100. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice or an offer to buy or sell any securities.
Alex and Jon, welcome to the Compute 100. Congratulations, the biological computing company. Here you are. I want to start this conversation with the first moment, Alex, that you ever saw neurons acting outside of the brain, making something happen in the world.
That happened a couple of years ago. It happened 2.5 years ago now.
Oh, I meant like 20 years ago.
Well, they weren't doing anything in the world then.
Wasn't there like a robotic arm?
Yeah, well, they weren't doing anything useful for the world.
Yeah, no, I mean
2.5
not
years ago,
useful.
we are the ones that made it do something useful
Yeah.
to the world. They were doing a bunch of unuseful things for about 20 years. So when I was in college, at a bunch of philosophy classes, I had a professor come from a different university across the street and presented his work on growing brain cells and electrodes. And he was doing to study aspects of human cognition, such as memory and creativity, and he actually was able to have a robotic arm attached to it. I was just floored by what he was doing. I had to work with him. I had to understand what he was doing, and so I started commuting across the street. It's actually kind of far. I was in Atlanta, and started working in his lab. Started studying the system and trying to understand it. And that was the first time that, at least I had the idea that we can use biological networks as a computing substrate.
And so going like a level deeper, what was he using and what were you actually seeing that he was able to use the neurons to actually go build?
So what he was trying to do is he was trying to take an image and he was trying to have the neurons try to draw it. It was very rudimentary at the time. There was only 4 electrodes. He did have an awesome paper looking at a embodied little animal in a computer screen and trying to see if he can train it to move. So these are the very foundations of what's kind of we call these days as real-time biological computing. But again, it's super fundamental. He was doing it to understand, are there single neuron interactions that we can see in biological networks that can define some of these processes? And so again, immediately at the time, I was a poor college student, so the application that came to me was, well, stock market, right? Why don't we encode the stock market into the biology, into the neurons, just have it make us all rich? So I pitched it to him. He thought it was a bad idea, and he actually, I don't even know if he knew who I was. I was in his lab like every day. But yeah, he turned it down, and I think the reason he did, the reason he did was because at the time it wasn't possible. But this kind of nagging idea of biological compute and applying it towards real-world use cases kind of stayed with me, and as I progressed on in my career as a neurosurgeon, neuroscientist, as I met Jon, and we started another company together, realized that you can fund your ideas in alternative ways outside of academia. Realized the convergence of multiple technologies in 2022 allowed us to actually be able to do this crazy idea. Why don't you tell me your background and
Yeah, that's a good idea. So I'm also a neurosurgeon, neuroscientist. I met Alex probably 15, 16 years ago at this point. We sort of had this immediate connection about pushing the envelope of what was possible. So like always thinking a little bit of like taking what we're doing and the knowledge we had and the experience we had of like, how can we push this to the limit? Like, what's the most ambitious, amazing thing that we can do? And I think from there it was sort of, we've just done everything together. It's friendship, residency, research. He's the godfather to my 2 children. He like signed my wedding. I don't know what language you signed it in, but your name
Russian.
In Russian on my wedding documents. So we've done everything together, and so I think that's really what bound us. But really, the arc is that we actually did the experiment. So the experiment he was thinking about 20 years ago, we got together. We used this machine here. We took neurons. We encoded S&P 500 market data. It didn't work. We didn't predict the stock market. I don't know how much it worked.
I think it worked.
But the point is that we could take like real world information and do something meaningful with it. Like we could take it, we can translate it into a signal that neurons can process. We can access real biology, and we could take it back into the real world. And that was the genesis of the company.
What he didn't mention was he worked on Wall Street before
That's true.
residency, and so the arc of encoding stock market values with the 2 of us actually made a lot of sense. And so that was the first experiment that we did. It wasn't the aha moment for us, even though we disagree on whether it worked or not. The aha moment came when we encoded a different data set and actually were able to show that, and we can get into this later, we were actually able to show that if you encode information and decode it in the right way, and you create an actual language to communicate with the biological network, with the actual neural tissue, you can improve AI systems going forward. And so that was kind of the aha moment for us that I was referring to earlier 2.5 years ago.
Let's just start with, what is the biological computing company?
Yeah, so we are defined by the products we're creating, and so we're going from wetware to software. So what that means is we have real brain cells, as you guys can see in a dish right here. They compute information in a very magical way, in a very specific way that's different than current silicon. It's much more complex, much more dynamic, it's much more energy efficient. And so what we're doing, the company, is we're taking the principles derived, and an asterisk for later, not inspired by, but derived from the tissue in our dish, and building algorithms from that. And so the product, what we're doing and who we are, is we're building software that's better, faster, and more efficient than current AI systems that are around now.
Let's, again, what is the biological computing company? And there is some extremely novel technological, biological underpinnings enabling this business. And so like, break it down for us. What are you building?
In a single word, we are building software. We are augmenting state-of-the-art algorithms. We're applying this right now to video generation, but can be applied multiple modalities very broadly. But right now we're building software. The way we get there is the crazy part. And we get there from growing neurons in a dish of electrodes. We take the information, the data that's used to train the algorithms that we're improving, okay? And we encode it via a language that we've created over the last many years into the biological network, into the biology. We then observe how the neurons process that information in a very special way, like our brains process that information. And we model that mathematically and apply that towards these algorithms. The way we build this software, the way we build these algorithms is by deriving neuroscience principles from this dish of neurons and applying them via adapters, via learning rules, and modifications of state-of-the-art models. So that's what we're doing right now.
There's another sort of maybe romanticized way of thinking about it, which is like we're returning to nature. So we are scientists. We are it's a discovery platform. So here is this amazing computer, the most perfect computer ever architected, evolved over hundreds of millions of years. I mean, we've thought about this a lot, right? It's like, how do we don't have the beauty is that we're not building the hardware. It's been built, it's been refined. It's extremely energy efficient. It can solve problems that silicon can't in ways that silicon can't process or make silicon better, for example. So how do we find a way to meaningfully communicate with that hardware? How can we return to nature and take those discoveries and apply it back to the real world in a very scientific, rigorous, reproducible way? And so everything Alex said is true for sure. That's what we're like physically doing. It's also bigger than that. It's like, how do we build the foundation of this like post-silicon era? How do we take these principles and push beyond language and beyond silicon to really open up what's possible from this amazing computer?
And when you say open up what's possible, at the end, like I appreciate both of these different angles on it. And Alex, you're saying we're building software, It's software to what aim?
So right now it's better quality. So we're applying this towards video generation. So the immediate use cases are generating more video, more realistic video, right? So what that means is the way objects interact in the video that we build are more plausible in terms of the physics, right? There's memory incorporated. So the things that the brain is very good at, we're able to incorporate into current algorithms. That's the acute sense. I think what Jon is referring to in the future is what we call real-time biological computing. And so we're starting with software, and that's very practical. That's certainly what's driving our product now, but this actually lays the foundation towards what we call real-time biological compute. What that means is actually incorporating the neurons, the brain cells, into the compute circuit. And so if we're talking about inference, for example, inference would happen through the biological network, and we would create predictions with the biology. So that's the future state, and that can lead to things like intuitive machines, right? So right now, the reason we have intuition is because our brain is predicting what the next frame around us is going to look like. It's constantly doing this prediction, right? And it's happening because of the special properties of how neurons are connected to one another, how they process information. We have access to that in the dish. And so in the future state, I would think about it as algorithms that are always learning, are always changing, just like your brain does, just like your brain is doing right now. But also algorithms that have intuition. So intuitive robots, for example, that aren't just programmed to do one or two things.
Can you just walk us through, because I want to be sure that anyone who's listening or watching to this leaves with an understanding of kind of the step-by-step processes that you're going through, and maybe to help us get there, like what were the technological breakthroughs that made this possible now? And then how are those technologies being applied in sort of a step-by-step way to get to where you are?
Yeah, I can start this with kind of when we started the company. It's the realization of why we thought it was possible at the time versus when my mentor 20 years ago didn't think it was possible, and now I agree with him. So there's three independent technological kind of verticals that came around. So one of which was the actual biology, right? So like you have to keep the cells alive long enough to encode information and to do the experiments that we need to do. And so at the time, at least in my hands, I was able to keep them alive for maybe a day or two. 20 years ago, now 6 months to a year, easy. Now that we're optimizing these protocols.
And what was the core thing driving the lengthening of that time?
Really meticulously the entire process. So the way we remove the brain, the way we cultivate it, or create it from stem cells. There are some trade secrets in there that I'm not going to tell the world. But the media in which they live, right? All of these things have been perfected over the last 20 years. And like I said, and there has been some breakthroughs at TBC that we've had in the last 3 years that have led us to really extend that lifespan. But again, things like lifespan really matters, right? And so that was a breakthrough.
And so what's the difference between TBC neurons and their lifespan and anybody else?
Months to maybe even over a year.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So keep the neurons alive.
Keep neurons alive. The hardware, the electrodes, right? I keep referring to electrodes, and probably people are thinking, well, why does he keep talking about electrodes, right?
You're keeping the neurons alive, and then they're sitting on some electrodes.
Right.
Why?
Here's one of our dishes, our multi-electrode arrays. If you guys want to zoom in, you can see the electrodes right in the middle. So, quick aside, what your brain is doing right now. So as you're looking at me, right, you see the pixels in front of me, and that's being converted by your eyes into electrical signals. So your brain understands information or the world around it in electrical signals, right? When we take a brain and we put it into the dish, or we create a brain from stem cells, we don't have those senses. We don't have that ability to convert information. And so we need them to live on electrodes so we can send electrical stimulation patterns into the biology to then encode information. So that's why we need electrodes. And that's why, going back to the original question, when we were doing this 20 years ago, we had 4 electrodes, now we have 4,096. We have the resolution to actually really recapitulate the world and images and other data formats and send it into the dish.
And it allows us to go between these worlds. And so that's a lot of the secret sauce of what we're doing is how do we take information from the physical world around us, translate it into an electrical signal, put it into another world. So from this world into this neural representation of that world, which is much higher, way higher dimensional, and then take it back out and do something meaningful with it. So we've developed a language, a way to communicate, and so it's switching, it's going back and forth.
And so if we look at that plate of electrodes, what essentially you guys are doing is talk about kind of the signals you're able to feed into the neurons that sit on that dish, how that kind of scale from 4 electrodes to 4,000 electrodes has enabled this incredible complexity in the data that comes out of the dish, and then the downstream process.
We talked about the hardware, we talked about the biology, right? But then over the last, I'd say 40 years, there's been a massive renaissance of computational neuroscience. And what I mean by that is when you have electrodes either in the brain, so Jon and I are both the types of neurosurgeons that place electrodes in the brain, or you have a brain on top of electrodes, you need to understand what those signals mean. You need to understand what these spikes that we're seeing on our screen, if they actually mean anything. And so the computational tools to understand these signals have been built across the last, like I said, 30 to 40 years. This is what brain-computer interface companies are built on the shoulders of, like Neuralink, for example, right? And so there's been a massive advance in that. And so when we started the company in 22, the convergence of these 3, at the time, independent fields became what we realized was biological computing. There's a 4th thing that happened in 22, which is there was a clear need for what we were building, right? This is around the time when the world realized how inefficient and how energy hungry transformer models or language models became. This idea of using all the world's data to train them came about a year after that, right? And so it was very timely for us to introduce a completely novel computing substrate that is, as already mentioned, massively more energy efficient, doesn't require all the world's data to train, and has been evolving for hundreds of millions of years, as Jon said.
And so what is the comparison? How much more efficient is it?
So the corollary in terms of having this conversation and being able to understand what we're talking about, for the brain requires a bite of a cheese sandwich.
So let's talk about the dish and actually what's going on here. So a plate of electrodes, you guys are using electrical signals to then simulate a set of cells that sit on that dish. And that's like, Jon, you keep referring to this ability to translate the digital world to the neural world and kind of pull things back to reality. Talk a little bit more about exactly what's going on in the dish and the way that you're actually able to then derive and build better algorithms because of it.
So there's 3 steps, right? The first step is encoding. And what we mean by that is, and again, we're working in the vision space, right? Mostly because of the way that we encode data. But you take a picture of my face, for example, of a number, for example, right? And you create a pattern that recapitulates that image or the pixels in the image, and you create a pattern of electrical stimulation. And what that means, we actually send current into the electrodes that define that pattern. That's encoding. And again, this is, we were in stealth, as you guys know, for about 3 years. This is what we're building behind the scenes, because before you can actually apply biological computing to anything, you need to figure out how to encode information. So that's step 1. The other thing we were building is the decoding process, right? This is what I mentioned earlier in terms of the computational tools to understand what these neural signals mean, right? So you encode and you send an electrical stimulus that shows you the world, shows the neurons the world around you, and then they respond. So after a certain segment of time, it's called 100 milliseconds, they will respond by being active, as you can see on the screen, right? We have to decode that into what's important. What are the important parts of where that response is happening? So spatially, which neurons are firing. When that response is happening, so temporally, when it's happening. And then also the pattern and the combination of neurons that are firing in response to a certain stimulus from the outside world. This is what Jon mentioned when we go from this world right now, which is a picture of my face, into the neurons world, which is what we call the neural representation of that, right? Now what happens is there's a transformation of information that goes from this world into the neurons world. And in the neurons world, it's much more complex, much more dynamic, and much more rich in information. So you have this expansion of features that happens, and it happens almost for free, with like a drop of sugar.
As you're saying that, I think I'm getting it in a new way. Like right now, I'm having this experience of you guys in this podcast. And my way of representing that, I could sort of try to talk about it for a while and describe what's going on. But if you were to take a picture of this, encode it into the dish with some representation, I've got a question about that. The decoding of what's going on is dramatically more sophisticated than how I could describe it. There's
Feature
like,
rich.
There's
Yeah.
way feature rich, yeah. They're like, I'm gonna use a black sweatshirt, gray sweatshirt, da da da. But how rich does that get with the neurons?
We haven't reached that limit yet.
Yeah.
We don't know, because if you think about, there's hundreds of thousands of neurons, and a lot of those features are encoded in patterns, and the patterns can be 1 or 2 neurons communicating, 3 communicating, when they're communicating. So there's this massive expansion of potential in terms of how you can encode those features. So another way to think about this is, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a neural representation of that picture is worth 1,000,000 words.
Mm-hmm. So I want to contrast it with classical computing in silicon. Like usually when we think about representation of information there, we think about bits of like a bunch of zeros and ones together. How does that relate to what's going on here?
It's fundamentally different.
Yeah, okay.
So the way biology computes information is not based on a CPU clock, it's event-based. There's infinite amounts of patterns that can emerge from it. It's actually fully parallelized, okay? And so, when we think about parallel computing in the classical sense, we're kind of hacking it, where your transistors are always going to be in serial, right? And so we're trying to do it from a software perspective, right? This is a fully parallelized system. So what that means, if you send information into one neuron, every single neuron is going to respond. And so there's recurrency associated with all of these concepts that can't and don't happen in silicon systems. That's what's responsible for these massive efficiency gains that we see. Mm-hmm. That's what's responsible for the ability to contextualize and not need all the world's data to train. I think something else that I didn't mention, I think is critical here, in addition to this feature expansion dimensionality increase that happens in the dish, it can also learn, mm-hmm. right? So your current hardware systems, right, are rigid. They're not going to change, right? You can learn algorithmically through backpropagation, which is very not biological, and we can talk about how that emerged later. But the biological system actually changes, right? And can learn through punishment and reward and through novel experiences. And that's fundamentally different than silicon compute. And we have access to that as well. And so we actually train the biology in our lab also.
So now, just to add to that, so now we have a computer that gets better over time. Mm-hmm. So just like we're having this conversation and we're getting new information, we're responding, we're updating that information. We're not even aware that we're updating that. We're doing that with extreme energy efficiency. Mm-hmm. So it's not stuck in the past. It's not stuck with like the last training run from the last event of data. Mm-hmm. It can update. And what Alex is referring to is something we call it closed loop, because it's a loop. It updates the new information, it gets better, yep. We can reinforce that. And so now we're talking about something that magically is learning in real time.
Yeah. So the AI industry today is trying to take as much information as it possibly can and create these neural nets that are extremely power intensive to run over and over and over again to try to be learning something. And what you have is a organic dish of neurons that is capable of ascertaining the information inherent in that original data in a dramatically faster way.
Correct. Not only are people trying to reteach these systems, they actually fail at some point. So this is the very well-known problem of continual learning. And so the more you train silicon-based AI systems today, the more they start to forget, right? Mm-hmm. And if you go to our blog post, number 4, you'll see that we applied some of the principles of how neurons learn through a learning rule and into an algorithm. And we showed that we actually significantly improved this concept of continual learning. So that's a nice way to kind of think about the third step of what we're doing, right? Again, we're building software, right? And how do we go from, so we've encoded information to the dish of neurons. We then built the language to understand what the neural response is, quantify it, and now we mathematically model it. And so now we need to go from physical world to neuron world to the digital world, right? Which is where we deploy into algorithms, which are our current products. Mm-hmm. And so what that means is we have hundreds and hundreds of these dishes that we've encoded images into, videos into. So our first application was in Minecraft, and so we have many of these brains that really understand Minecraft these days, right? And so we encode Minecraft images, and we learn how the neurons represent that information, right? And we mathematically model across many, many plates, right? And we can build software modules. We can build, as I mentioned, learning rules. that plug into current day architectures and will actually improve outcomes, will actually improve how much video we can create and lengthen that, double it. We've actually, on our blog, we've doubled it. Since then, we've 5x that, right? We can improve the quality of the images that come out. And so these are very tangible results that essentially come from just borrowing how the brain processes information and applying it algorithmically.
Yep.
And that's a huge point, because what we're talking about now is finding a way to commercialize this today. Is finding a way to like actually plug it into existing workflows to make state-of-the-art models better, faster, cheaper today, right? So it's all of these amazing things that the brain is capable of doing, and translating that into today's models while still working towards the future state of how can we push past that.
And for many years, people have talked about biologically inspired AI,
Yeah.
right? And in fact, that's how AI came around, right? And so the late 1940s, early 1950s, we had the McCullough-Pitts neuron, which was the first, it's a piece of a deep neural network, right? And it was supposed to recapitulate how we understood neurons processed information in the 1950s, right? Going forward in history until the 1980s, there was no way to mathematically understand learning, right? Until backpropagation happened, right? Backpropagation is not biological. That was won the Nobel Prize. It led to all the applications that we have today. But in my opinion, it was the divergence from biological-like systems to very non-biological. And so then fast forward to now, to 2026, right? We have very capable systems, but they're using all the world data, as I mentioned earlier, right? We have to, people are putting data centers in space because they're so energy hungry, right? And that's because we've diverged from biology. And so one of the premise of the company was, why don't we go back to biological systems and understand them, but not from a 1940s perspective, from a 2026 perspective, where we have these tools that allow us to observe how neurons communicate and apply them to current AI systems, build new AI software, ultimately build new AI hardware that more closely mimics the biology. And so, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of biologically inspired compute has been around for a long time. A lot of massive companies have made a lot of headway in trying to mimic how neurons process, but it always stops at inspiration, right? And the reason for that is until today, until TBC came around, no one has had actual access to the biology to perform targeted experiments to ask some of these fundamental questions of compute and then build from that. And that's what we're bringing to the world.
I think that's a great answer, part of the answer to the question that I know you guys have gotten, which is isn't silicon just going to keep getting better, and why invest in doing all of this? We're sitting across a lab that you guys run. We're in this incredible, space that you guys are building with neurons, and so that's part of the answer. But I would love to hear just more of how you guys think about why this is worth the investment.
I agree that silicon's going to keep getting better. I think algorithms are going to keep getting better, and we're playing a role in that, right? And so the way, in our opinions, it gets better is not through better engineering, is through going back to the biology, right? And we're the only ones that have access to inform the next wave of software, the next wave of hardware, right? So I do think it's going to keep getting better. Now, at some point, I do think there's going to be a limit to what we can do with silicon, right? I think that the applications are going to end up becoming limited. I think that things like intuition is going to be very hard to encode in silicon. Learning continues to be a problem. I think will continue to be a problem just because of the fundamental differences of how the two compute substrates work. And that's the perfect time where we insert real-time biological compute. So as we lay that foundation now, ultimately in the next 5-10 years, we will get to the point where we're actually able to incorporate the biology into the circuit to get around some limitations that are coming.
And those limitations is not just about power efficiency, although that's part of it. It's about actually, in order to produce a result through inference that it incorporates, say, intuition, there's a moment where an algorithm plus silicon it has a ceiling that
yes,
that the biology won't.
Intuition, learning is a huge thing, right? Again, no matter what you do algorithmically, your silicon substrate is going to be rigid, right? Whereas the complete opposite with biology, right? And so if you want to continuously updating personalized AI algorithm that's following you around everywhere, right? It's got to be through biology.
And the types of information that can be used and processed by a biological computer versus a silicon one. And so there are a couple super interesting points, which is where I thought you were going to go with the encoding part, which was the brain is very multimodal. It can process lots of different types of information at the same time extremely efficiently. So like just having this conversation, we're processing visual information, we're processing, sound, sensory experience. We're literally all of the information streams from the world around us, we're processing that in a super, extremely energy efficient way and using that to interact with the world around us. And there's this really good analogy that Alex and I talk about. I have 2 young kids, and the world today is dominated by language models. It's like, how do we process information through language and have that fit our world? But kids learn before they're 1 or 2, when they develop words, they learn a lot how to interact with the world, and most of that is not language based. So the language is just the tip of the iceberg of the information that's actually out there in the real world. And so now we have this actual processor that can handle all that different type of information and push past that barrier.
So we have an investment we did in a quantum company, and the quantum world talks about this idea of quantum advantage, of like where you get to this moment where quantum computers have a commercial advantage over classical computers that will be like this kind of watershed moment for the industry. You guys have been like living and breathing this for many, many years, trying to understand like, is there value here? I believe there must be value here. From a first principles perspective, there's value here. We've now been running experiments that has grown our conviction that there's value here, and I'd love to talk about what is like some of those steps. And then what is the point where it really shifts, where all of a sudden this moves from a wild idea that Alex and Jon and your team believe in deeply to the industry needs to take it really seriously. So let's start with like, what's the evidence that you have that this is real?
Sure. So started with MNIST. Okay, so quick history on MNIST. Handwritten numbers by grad students. The whole idea is everyone's 5, 6, a little bit different, right? So can we build an algorithm to classify them? Classic problem in computer vision was solved at this point, right? Also was a way that we can encode information through space in the dish. And we did that. So we encoded a bunch of numbers into the biological network, into the bio, and we asked a very simple question. Can we use the neural response? Can we use the neural representation of those numbers, neuron world, right, to then retrain a similar classifier, a similar algorithm to classify these numbers, right? So at the time, this was about 2.5 years ago, at the time, we just wanted to get any kind of result above chance. And chance, there's 10 characters, it's 10%. What actually ended up happening was every single time, and this is also on our blog, every single time we showed more accuracy when we classified the number based on a neural response compared to the image alone. That was the very first time, as far as we've seen, that anyone's used biology, so going from like brain cells, right, into a real computational task, into classification of numbers. Simple task, not super useful because it's been solved, but a real task, right? I don't want to speak for Jon, but I think the both of us, when we saw that result, that's when we flipped. That's when it was like, okay, we've got something special and we can access it and it actually works in the real world, right?
And it outperforms
And
what
it outperforms,
is existing.
exactly. It's not just it doesn't work, it outperforms, right? Which was crazy, right?
And this is without like a huge AI and neuro and bio team. This is like with a
4 of us
super
at the
small.
time.
Yeah,
This was
us,
4 of
like,
you
with
guys
minimal
in
funding.
Baltimore working out of a
Right.
your lab.
So then our minds immediately go like, well, what's possible if we do this on a bigger scale, right? Like there's a huge need. We can do this relatively easily by accessing this computer. Where can we take this? Where can we push this? What are the limits of this?
Yeah.
So now to answer your question earlier, right? So how does the world believe this, right? So first of all, we're building in the open, right? So I've said the blog a bunch of times. I've tried to get people to go to it because I want people to see what we're doing, right? This is the way the rest of the world gains conviction, right? What we're building is very unique, right? And so there's clearly a lot of interest, but there's a lot of skepticism also, as there should be, right? We are scientists. Most of our company are scientists. We are very rigorous in the way we do things. And so we chose to be transparent in terms of the data we present, right? And so we will continue to update it with newer and newer data. But I think that ultimately it's going to be somebody using it, right? Ultimately, that's going to be really the flip that you're talking about, which is coming shortly, essentially. And when we go from brain cells in a dish, right, to, some dude in some part of the country going on the marketplace and using our biologically derived video generation model because it shows better images and it's cheaper to use, that's the fundamental unlock. And we are heading in that direction very shortly.
Right, and again, that's this point of commercializing right now, today. We have a signed contract. We have models that are already better.
Multiple signed contracts.
Multiple signed contracts. And Alex, what you're referring to, I think should not be understated. It's like the first time in the world that you could take, it's crazy, take a dish of neurons in a lab and apply it to a state-of-the-art model that's dramatically better, and have someone outside the lab completely disconnected from any biology, from any lab, from any science, use it in a very meaningful way, and then pay for that. And that scales. So now we're talking about optimizing open source inference in the cloud. This is a massive business that's unlocked today.
So that is the neurons have given us better software that allow you to run inference on an open source model. Is it still an open source model at that point, or is it a TBC model?
It's a TBC model.
So it's the TBC model that has been inspired by an open source model.
It's built on top of an open source model.
That anyone can use.
In a world of the future, right? World of the future, we often get asked this question: are we replacing silicon? Is the next substrate purely biology, right? The answer is no. In the world of the future, first of all, we need silicon to decode the neural responses to perform the tasks that we do, and so there's always going to be some kind of combination. But in the future world, there's going to be things that pure silicon is good at. Like, this is never going to replace a calculator. This doesn't know all of the, this doesn't have all of Wikipedia encoded into it, right? So brains, even though we know a lot, we don't have access to that information unless we're using silicon computer, right? And so in the future state, there are going to be things that intuition, pattern recognition, right? Things that biocompute is good at, which will be used for that. There's going to be calculators that are going to be built from silicon. There's going to be code breakers built from quantum, right? And so there's going to be all of these additional computing techniques that are going to be distributed towards the things that they're good at.
It's so interesting. You guys started this company in 2022, was it when you started it? Started the company in 2022. We're now in 2026. Compute is the only thing that is top of mind across public and private markets. And you guys were not compute guys before coming into this. I don't know if we've made it clear enough that you were both neurosurgeons before you started to be doing this today and to have timed this opportunity is just incredible. So take us into that story of what it has been like to go from neurosurgeons to building in what is the most important market of my lifetime, probably all of our lifetimes, and also being frankly outsiders to it, total outsiders on the compute side.
You start.
I'll start.
Yeah.
We'll start with a pushback.
Please.
I don't agree that we weren't compute guys, right? I just think that compute hasn't caught up to us until today.
We're the ultimate compute guys.
We're the ultimate. No, seriously.
If the brain is truly the best computer, you were studying the brain and the best computer of time.
Throughout our entire careers, right, we have had access to the brain at all hierarchical levels, right? Starting from the entire brain in humans, and again, we are the type of neurosurgeons that implant electrodes, record from the brain during human behavior, during pathological states like epilepsy or Parkinson's disease, right? So we've seen that level of the brain, and for many years, as I said, have grown brains in a dish to understand them as well. So for the last multiple decades, we've had access to all levels of biological computing, right? And so I would push back on that and say that I think in terms of this idea of entering Silicon Valley, entering the compute space, I think it was a natural transition. I mean, again, sometimes you have to be a little bit lucky, and we were lucky enough to be born in a time and have had access to kind of the tools that we've had over the last 20 years to find ourselves in this moment where it can actually be applied.
And how has that just driven your conviction behind the thesis that this is like, I love the phrase of like, it is returning to nature. And maybe it's like, it's this idea of like the compressed 21st century, AI is accelerating everything. Like that return to nature now with TBC is happening this year. It's not happening in 10 years or in 100 years. And so that's all been because of the market that we're living in. And so just like, how does that feel?
I mean, it feels like the most important thing that we can be doing,
Yeah.
right? Like, we get asked a lot, how does it feel to, like you said earlier, right, transition from academic neurosurgery, right, into a space that's foreign to us. And to me, it's just obvious. There's no question, right? It has to happen, right? We have been building these tools to be the ones to bring this to the world over the last 2 decades. And this is our calling. This is what we have to do. It's just obvious.
There's a natural tension of what we're sort of skirting around, which is, on the one hand, you have, and we're showing that this is commercialized today, and what we're working towards, this is a total game-changing technology. This is not an iterative, small step change. This is a fundamentally new way of interacting with the world and understanding the world around us and computing for the real world. It's huge. And so we get asked this question, and we laugh about this kind of in hindsight, from investors or reporters, whoever. Like, how can you possibly catch up to Google or whoever? How can you possibly catch up to a hyperscaler or a silicon company that's been doing this for 50 years, 100 years? It's like, well, we've been doing it for 500 million years, right? So how do we take that and turn that into a reproducible, competitive, sustainable advantage in a very conscientious way that gets us to here while keeping in mind that it's the obvious, simple, returning to nature principle all along.
So let's walk through that. So you produce a better model. People are paying for it. What's the next step?
Scale. More models, more insights. There's many ways to scale, right? So current model better, continue to improve it. So as I mentioned, a month ago, we were 2-fold in terms of our rollout metric. Now we're 5-fold, okay? Quality of the images, we continue to improve that, right? There are things that we're looking at like physical representation, I mentioned this earlier. So in a video that's generated, the objects actually maintain physics, the Newtonian physics. There's friction, there's gravity, et cetera, right? If you're interacting with the video in front of you and you push something, through our algorithms, it actually improves that. So you actually interact, and we have metrics for all of this. And so the way you scale is continue to improve the current model and scale it to other models as well. And we'll continue to do that from a software product perspective. In the meantime, as I alluded to earlier, this is the foundation, right, for real-time biological compute. We have a very significant effort to understand how to train the biological network, not just encode information, but teach the biology, right? Take a lot of the principles that we're gathering from building software into transforming the biological hardware itself. And there's going to be some kind of inflection point in the next probably 5 years where we take these models that we've optimized from pure biological principles and make them even better by plugging the bio in. And so if you look at the kind of the arc of why we're doing this, building software is not just a way for us to gain revenue before we get to this real-time biocompute thing. It's actually building the tools so we can understand biocompute or real-time biocompute in the future. We have actual model that's based on biological principles that will take in the biology much more easily. And so that's going to be the inflection point for real-time biocompute.
And to be clear, what you're referring to now is having neurons in the actual loop of computing.
Yeah. So that inflection point is when it's no longer where the product is software, but the product is computing for end results.
The biology is computing.
Yes.
The endpoints are coming from, it's going to be a combination of software plus bio, but yes.
It's really interesting in terms of thinking about what I think a lot of people believe around a bionic future of like how humans will eventually integrate more and more technology into our beings, that like there's a parallel going on of the actual substrate of computation itself becoming more integrated as well. Is that
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't thought of it that way. I mean, there's a ton of parallels, right?
Yeah.
When we were first talking about the company, we often would get this, we would pitch it and talk about it, but then we'd be like, so you guys are building Neuralink? right? And the answer is no, we're not, right?
Yeah.
It's like flipped on its head, no pun intended, right? We're like, we're doing the exact opposite. But to your point, right, as technology gets more integrated into the brain, into our existence, right, through what we're doing, the brain will get more integrated into technology as well. So there's a clear parallel between the fields.
Yeah.
It's a very fun time horizon that you guys are building on.
Mm-hmm.
It's both. There's an immediate commercial opportunity, but it's really 5 years is 10 years. There's some big other transformative moments.
It's almost as if that was intentional.
Yeah, I do want to get to
the journey. I mean, this has been an incredible journey for you guys. I think maybe starting off with talking about like that friction you mentioned around people saying like, are you just building Neuralink? Like, what's actually happening? How have you seen that, you guys have had to evolve as founders, pitching this business, building, momentum around it, whether it be fundraising, reporters, all of that.
And let's do some facts. Like, how much have you raised? What is the team today? Who's on the team?
Speaking of parallel, worlds and kind of the theme of today, as we were building the language to encode information to the biology, we were actually developing the language of how do we discuss this and describe it to people, right? Over many pitches, conversations, right, our not only rhetoric evolved, right, but also that helped to actually crystallize what we're building, right? And so the conversation we've had about it forced us to think about this critically and about the important parts of this. And it's not just narrating a story, right? The story is being narrated in the products that we're building, right? And so yeah, that was a natural evolution for us. I think broadly speaking, if you have a good idea and it's a transformative idea, you have to bring it to the world, and people will fund it. People will put money into it, right? You have to explain it in a way that's understandable. And if it's in the academic world, you have to write a grant. If it's in the venture world, you have to pitch it, right? But in either way, it's the same principle, right? You have an awesome idea, it's going to transform the world. And so, yeah, Jon can help talk about.
Going back to sort of the beginning of this conversation, what binds us and keeps us together is really this outsized ambition. It's like, how far can we take this? And we're in a golden age of entrepreneurship. If you have this idea, there's a lot of technology, a lot of resources to actually build it, and to build it at scale and to move quickly and execute. And so it's been a wild ride. We went from 5 people a year ago, as you know, to now over 25. We just made our 25th hire. We're going to 35 by the end of the year. We've raised $50 million this year at seed stage. And so the only thing that we know how to do together is swing for the fences. And that's exactly what we're doing. So and the way we think about it is we're building this ecosystem. It's as frontier, it's as new, it's as uncharted as it gets. And it's super exciting. It's also like the hardest problem to work on. So it's fun.
Who's on the team?
So it's divided into a couple of segments, right? So in addition to us, there's a bio team, right? And so maintain the cultures, optimize the cultures, perform experiments, asking, what the culture, meaning the biological tissue, what the culture of the future is, right? We have a computational neuroscience or neuroscience team, right? These are the people that are responsible for the squiggles, right? So like, what is it that comes out of the dish? How do we make sense of it? How do we encode information, right? Then we have pure AI researchers, right? These are folks from Meta, Apple that have been building these architectures from the ground up since the beginning, right? We also have our product team, right? That's translating all of these crazy insights into the products we have today. And I think the most magical thing that we have is the conversation between these people, right? This is, as Jon said, the hardest problem, right? But so many different perspectives coming from so many different worlds coming together in person, right, to understand it, understand how to productize it, and how it informs kind of future AI systems. So yeah, it's incredible to watch everyone work together and really, there's like a new idea, 10 new ideas every single day that get created on the whiteboard and sometimes erased and recreated. So.
Yeah. And as academics now, as co-founders of a seed stage, well on your way to a Series A startup, how has the academic background really propelled the business to what it is today?
I think the other unique part of what we're building is the deep exploratory arm. So I think that going back to our team, it's like half academicians that we pulled from surrounding institutions, right, to half industry people, right? And I think that we always maintain this deep exploratory arm to what we're building, right? We always have to ask hypothesis-driven questions, right? But we need the industry guys to say it's got to be done fast and it's got to be applied to something real, right? And so this combination of like this fail fast method of forced innovation, right, has really, it combined with these multiple perspectives on this single problem, is kind of the magic that we've been able to create.
Yeah, I think it's going back to the science. You know, it's fun. We argue about this all the time. You know, he says it's always about the science. I say it's also about the story, right? It's ultimately the two coming together. And that's what makes this so unique, is that it's not a science project. It's not hype. This is happening right now in a you can't see it, but a real lab, right? And so it's pretty incredible.
What's your advice to other neurosurgeons that want to start startups?
If you have a good idea, bring it to the world. It's not about startup. It's not about academia. It's like, if you want to bring something to the world, you'll find a way to do it. And then if the appropriate way is through entrepreneurship, through a startup, then do it that way, right? If it's through writing grants and getting funding, it's do it that way. It's just like, if you have a good idea, you got to do it.
Yeah. So what's next for TBC?
Well, as I said, we will have this aha moment for the world coming shortly, where we are serving our TBC enhanced state-of-the-art models to the masses, right? We expect everyone to start using them, and we'll go from there.
So what is TBC in 2030, 2040? Take us, to that timeline.
2030 is the world is run by TBC optimized algorithms, right? They're much more efficient, have better outcomes, but they're still algorithms, right? That's also the point at which we'll start to introduce real-time biological computing, where not just more efficient with better outcomes, we have new applications, new things that these algorithms can do that has never been done before, right? 2040 is an elaboration of that. So now, rather than having it across a single dish, we now have multiple dishes that are working in parallel to do this. 5 years later, it's data centers. And these data centers are distributing compute into the biology, into GPUs. Again, this is a combination workflow, right? Where we're able to have many fold efficiency gains if you're really just talking about energy demand, but also, like I said, intuitive machines that continuously learn. And then everywhere beyond that.
You're talking about less than 4 years from now, the world being run on TBC algorithms. That sounds kind of crazy. What does that mean? Like, is the scale that you talk about, like how many AI researchers do you need to do a 1/100th of that?
So in addition to the AI researchers that are doing the work, we've got hundreds of these plates, right? And so we have the massive scale to encode data into the biology and abstract and decode from it, right? So we have a lot of workers that are helping us, first of all. Second of all, in just a short period of time, right, we haven't been working on video generation the whole time, right? Like, we've been building the language to get this to this point until about 6 months ago, 6 to 9 months ago. So in just a short period of time, we've taken, when I say state-of-the-art algorithms that are open sourced, put out to the world. I'm not going to mention which one just yet, but put out to the world by massive companies with much larger workforce than we have, right? And we're beating it. We're beating it in metrics that, like, it's, are important to everybody. Like, how much video can you generate? How crisp is the video that you generate? And we've done this in a very short period of time. And so if we continue to follow that trajectory, right, unless there's some kind of massive breakthrough on the silicon side that happens, which could be the case, right, then I don't see a world where people aren't using our 5, 10, 20x improved quality metrics, 5, 10, 20x improvement in terms of cost algorithms, right? I think the only limitation for us is how many different types of algorithms we can scale, right? And I think that's a real question.
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of getting at. It's like, are you going to be replacing the YouTube recommendation algorithm?
Well, right now we're starting with video. Like I said, I mean, there's multiple video generation models out there. And so they're all, not all of them, but they have similarities. And so the natural point over the next year to two is to scale across similar type models, right? We also are tackling problems in language as well, right? So we went toward video generation again for practical reasons, also because there's a lot less understood and there's a lot more room for growth. But there are some sticky problems like continual learning, for example, or generalizing or out of distribution generalizability, right? That most language models and other models have today as well, and we can start tackling those problems with our biologically derived processes.
Amazing. Alex, Jon, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.